I would say, like, I'm somewhat of a mixed bag. I mean,
Well, you're a fighter, and you don't like to lose, and you are determined that you don't. Basically, I mean, you are.
sure, I don't like to lose. I'm not sure many people do. But the truth matters to me a lot. Really, like, sort of pathologically, it matters to me.
Folks, welcome to Left Reckoning, where the truth matters pathologically to us. So much so that we won't randomly accuse somebody of being a pedophile to millions of people. I'm Matt. Like, with me as always, David Griscom. Hello, David.
Hey, man. How's it going?
It's going well. It's going well. We have some good news about our boy Bernie Sanders, perhaps. I mean, it's news. It feels like old days. We got Elias Cepeda joining us to talk about UFC. Let me just mute all that out. And I am very excited. And yeah, how are you doing?
I'm good, man. I'm really looking forward to having Elias on. He's a good guy and a good friend, and I'm looking forward to having him on the main show for his first Left Reckoning main show debut.
That's true. I always feel like when we do have people on for the first time in the patron show, it feels like a trial, but that's never really like how we plan it out in our minds. But yeah, I mean, Elias is ready for prime time. We can just say that for sure.
He was born ready. Yeah, and then we also got some more fun stuff coming up. We're going to be talking about why Twitter should be paying you for your services, and also an unfortunate update in the persecution and attempt to torture journalist Julian Assange by the American government and the United Kingdom's complicity in that. And then in the post game, a hell of a lot more. We'll be taking people's questions, voicemails, and we got some fun clips for y'all there too. So make sure that you join us immediately after the show ends for that as well.
Yep, patreon.com/Left Reckoning. Also, you'll want to get our discussion with Lillian Chichurkia on liberal. Yeah. I think you got it wrong, but maybe
that's confidently correcting you.
but maybe I actually got it wrong. Anyway, we had a good discussion with her on our most recent Sunday show.
That's like what happened when I was on Majority Report last week. I've been practicing trying to say all the Mexican states, and when I got to Tamaulipas, I like lost my mind. I've been practicing so hard, and it was like prime time, ready to go, and I just completely froze. I mean,
hey, it's playoff basketball time.
There we go. Well, but should we talk? Sorry, I was just gonna say, should we talk about our boy Bernie? There's some news there.
There is. Where should we start with our Bernie update today? Should we talk about the main headline?
Let's talk about the main headline, and we could talk about why that energy is worthwhile bringing back. But for folks who didn't see, this is just sort of breaking this afternoon, and these things are sort of leaked, undisclosed sources things. But effectively, Bernie Sanders, a confidant of his, said that if Biden does not run in the next cycle, that Bernie Sanders very likely will throw his hat in the ring for yet another attempt at trying to win the presidency. And it's interesting because I will be honest, I didn't think that was really even an option, something that he was seriously considering. We're still ways out too, but I'll tell y'all, I mean, we're looking at what's very likely to be a complete trouncing of the Democratic Party in the midterms coming up later this year. So I mean the board is not yet set, so it will be interesting to see what happens in the near future regarding that.
Well, that's where this news came from. So there's this article here, and a few people have reported on it, but Bernie Sanders' team says he's has not ruled out a 2024 bid if Biden doesn't run. Which is unlike what the based move he made back in. He said Obama should be primaried, even if he wants it. But anyway, that he got hit on in 2016. But anyway, what this news comes from a memo put out by Faz Shakir, a former campaign
Okay.
manager for Bernie. And it's in the context of a few things. One is like what you mentioned about the upcoming elections, which is that Democrats are getting shellacked by particularly like young voters. And just a pure like political calculation is it'd be good for the Democratic Party if Bernie ran again, honestly. If that's something you cared about. Because they don't have anybody that is speaking to these sorts of folks, and Biden's underwater with the youth, and so it. And the other interesting thing about this is it's a memo of advice for candidates who have previously supported Bernie or who Bernie has endorsed, and it's telling them that when the corporate money comes around and says and it attacks you for having supported Bernie, you should embrace it and lean into it and wear it as a badge of honor, which I really like. I mean, I don't know how this doesn't work any other way at this point if we're already running from Bernie previously. So that's the context here.
Yeah, and I mean, like strategically, I mean, we've talked a lot about this because I've said this and I still believe it, that I think that Democratic socialists need to be thinking a bit differently than worrying so much about the office of the presidency, because remembering what the real advantages of those two moments, both in 2016 and 2020, was like uniting and bringing together a lot of people with a shared vision, and the hope was that would sort of turn into some kind of stronger organization for left and working class politics in this country. And I've been critical of Bernie because I don't think that he's done enough, in my opinion, to build that. All the criticism doesn't fall solely on his shoulders, but I think that a lot more could and should be done regarding building a kind of independent and strong working class and socialist movement, and organization in particular in this country. But that being said, I mean, I'll go for it again. I'll go for it for a third round because just sort of loosely, one of the reasons that I've been sort of hard on people who have been really trying to push, like, oh, we need to figure out like some new character to sort of bring in as our like big candidate to rally around in that 2024 cycle, is that one, I haven't seen much from the bench that really inspires a lot of confidence. I think Bernie Sanders running and sort of holding up the progressive mantle, even if it's might not look like it's going to be successful, is worthwhile. If anything, if it sort of blocks this movement from sort of being funneled every different direction into people like Ro Khanna or a Jayapal or people like that, which I think would be absolutely disastrous for this movement. Because I mean, one of the things that's really important about the Bernie Sanders movement and what's come out of it is that it's been socialist, and I think that a real disaster would happen if you had a kind of fracture between a kind of like progressive wing of capital, and basically trying to figure out which of the progressive capitals people want to be supporting. I think Bernie running would sort of preclude that fracturing, or at least would show to any of the people who are sort of leaving and trying to take other people with them that they were never really interested in this project from the get-go, right? So I think that that's super helpful. And also, I mean, no one brings the energy and the clarity of Bernie Sanders yet on the national level. I don't know if you have this clip handy, Matt. But this is just like the kind of thing we want to be seeing much, much more. And the thing was, when Bernie Sanders is running for president, he gets a lot more eyes on these kind of statements that he's out here making.
Yeah, and this is just Bernie today in the committee.
When we talk about why the American people are angry, why, among other things, we're seeing a spurt in the growth of trade unionism in this country, it has a lot to do with the fact that CEOs in large corporations now make 350 times more than their average workers. In addition to that, they receive stock options, golden parachutes, and a wide range of perks go to the CEOs. And meanwhile, working families are struggling to pay their bills, to feed their kids, to take a few weeks vacation, and to save up for retirement. So what we are seeing now is more income and wealth inequality in this country than we have seen in 100 years. And this is an issue that if nobody else wants to talk about, we will talk about in this committee.
There you go.
No, I mean, totally. And let me share this as well with y'all because, Bernie has continued, as he always has, to be consistent on these things. This is from earlier this morning. Chris Smalls tweeting out breaking news: Bernie Sanders is coming to New York City to visit Amazon labor and the workers of Amazon this Sunday. I can't point to another politician who was willing not only to sort of, show up in this way, but to do it in a way that is really trying to bring power and deliver it to the people rather than just sort of, standing in front of these kind of movements. The Bernie Sanders campaign really brought a lot of people into politics, but it brought them into politics in a way where we were sort of responsible too for participating and creating something on our own rather than everyone just sort of having to fall in line behind Bernie. And I'll tell you right now that if you get one of these other kind of progressive capitalist characters in that position, they will sort of demand that kind of conformity that Bernie Sanders has it.
Yeah, can you go back to that tweet? I just want to see somebody was trying to like tattletale on Smalls. Here's what you said. I just want to see what that worm was saying.
Sure.
Um, uh, yeah. So Peters, whatever, says, hope the visit helps build solidarity as you prepare to bargain your first contract. That said, here's what I said. Here's what I said after your big win. Oh, okay, never mind. I thought that was what does he say? This
Don't
win
let it
and all
be
the.
co-opted by any politicians looking for a piece of your limelight.
Okay, fair
Um,
enough. That's a fair enough point. I thought that was trying to say like you went after AOC
oh
after your
no,
win.
no.
So good. Okay, that was fine then. False alarm. I should have gone after that guy.
And I think we'll talk about Smalls a little bit later. With Elias, maybe talking a little bit about what's going on with him and AOC and the Tucker Carlson thing. But
Yeah.
look, I mean, the thing is, I don't want to sound like I'm not excited about a 2024 Bernie run because again, I think that puts us in the strongest position to gain some victories in that period. Um, but I don't think that even if he does run, that changes the landscape for what we need to be doing.
Yeah.
Because as I've said time and time again, Bernie would always make this point that if he did come into power, we would need to have very strong and mobilized base to basically challenge the state. And again, I've been telling socialists in particular to really start taking state power seriously and understanding that winning an election in itself is like only the first step in any kind of revolutionary project. And because we're so far from it, sometimes I feel like people don't engage with what success would actually
Yeah.
need, what we would actually need to be successful within the state. But this is the time right now to start building up our capability and capacity so that all of these kind of internal structures that exist within, it's not unique to America, but within the American state, that will be completely hostile to even a kind of mild program that Bernie would probably put forward. We need to start building up those capacities, right? And it's the same tactic and the same need if Bernie doesn't run in 2024. So, while like again, I'm stoked. I think at least for people who feel like they really need to have a kind of presidential figurehead for these things to matter, which I think is a little bit of a mistake. But if that sort of assuages, and calms and whets the appetite of people who feel like they need that, I think that's great because it settles the question, and then we can start thinking more seriously about like the on the ground struggle that will be necessary if we ever want to see any kind of left success in this country.
Agreed.
Well, I think we might bring on Elias in just a second. But before we bring him on, we're working on getting something fun for y'all out this Sunday. We've had a couple hiccups this week, but we've got a bonus episode coming up for y'all. We got the post game right after the show. You can leave us voicemails, Discord questions. We'll be having a hell of a lot of fun. Also, Matt and I have something exciting to announce for folks. That next Thursday, April 28th, will be the first Left Reckoning virtual meetup. So that will be for people who are in our solidarity tier and above on Patreon. We'll be just sort of hanging out and doing a virtual chat with the listeners. So if you're in that tier, look out for announcements. And if you'd like to participate, you can always sign up at patreon.com/leftreckoning.
Go do it, folks.
All right. Well, I think, are we ready for Elias?
Yeah, let's do it. So, joining us now, bring him in. Elias Cepeda, he is a writer on topics political, cultural, media, and sport. He's been on the show before. Go check out our previous episode. Elias, thanks for joining us once again.
Thanks for having me on, guys.
So, Elias, want to talk to you about a couple things, including the dynamics between Smalls and sort of politics, basically. But first, you have a piece here. Let's hear it for the good guy, Aljamain Sterling. And I'm kind of in a sports mood. Basketball's in the first round of the playoffs. So this is a keen interest. We just had Walls on, so this may be a sports month. But what's interesting about all these stories is how much real sort of central dynamics to American exploitation you see in a lot of these things. So I'll just put this up here now for us. People can check it out at eliascepeda.substack.com. But I want to play before we get to this. There's this tweet here, and then you can help explain what we're seeing. So this is a guy, Stevie J online, at UFC 273. The look of disgust and disappointment on Dana White's face when he noticed the winner on the scorecard is hilarious. And I'll just play this here. And Dana White's the guy in the background there, the bald guy. Okay. So, Elias, for folks who aren't UFC fans, that aren't sure what they're seeing there, explain it for us.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for the setup there and for talking about the article. All right, so this is pretty interesting because on its face, what you have behind you, the bald guy in the black, Dana White, the president of the largest mixed martial arts organization in the world. So that's like the UFC, which is like the NFL to American football or something of that nature. He gets a glimpse because this is a fight that went to a decision. So there's judges that are weighing in, and we're all waiting to see who won: Aljamain Sterling or Peter Yan. Peter Yan is from Russia. Aljamain Sterling is American, Jamaican descent, and they're both waiting. This is a rematch. There was a lot of bad blood, and Dana White sees a glimpse of what we're about to hear, which is that Aljamain Sterling wins by a split decision, meaning there's two judges that had him winning, and one judge had it for his opponent. This was again a rematch of an earlier fight, and the reason this disgust is so noteworthy is that Aljamain Sterling, again, is an American, and you can see it right there. He's a good-looking guy, looks like an action figure, very marketable. What you can't see there is that he's super charismatic. Obviously he's fluent in English as opposed to his opponent, which opens up a lot of opportunities. He's also a really inspiring story. In their first fight, he won the first fight between he and his opponent over a year ago. Aljamain Sterling won by disqualification because his opponent committed one of the most egregious and inexcusable fouls we've seen in the modern history of the sport. It concussed him. He was out. He had all sorts of issues, including an injury that required neck surgery. His doctors reportedly told Aljamain Sterling that he would never fight again, yet he gave his opponent, his cheating opponent, an immediate rematch, recovered from the surgeries, came back, defied, the odds and what medical experts said would be possible, and had a great fight, a really great fight, fought much better than they did in the first one. Certainly, in my subjective opinion, deserved the win. So you have an inspiring story here of a guy beating the odds, beating a cheater, a Russian cheater at that, right? In this climate, a dirty Russian cheater. And yet Dana White kind of mirrors the disgust we've seen all throughout this past year, where Aljamain Sterling is the one getting booed. At press conferences, he's the one getting flack on social media. So it's really, really noteworthy, and one has to ask, why is that happening? Well, it actually fits into a pretty well-established pattern for all those that can read this type of thing, and that is, depending how you want to order this, right? Where you put the intersection of class and of race, you have a black UFC athlete who is outspoken, and not just outspoken, but outspoken historically in criticism of the UFC's labor practice. And the UFC, as opposed to the other leagues that you'll watch on ESPN and on paper, and like where they have a broadcast contract with, has athletes that are not employees, that are considered independent contractors, despite having all sorts of requirements placed on them. They're not in unions or associations, athletes associations. They get a smaller percentage of overall revenue than do any other athletes in major organizations like the MLB or NFL or NBA. And we've seen this time and time again with the UFC, really, and Dana White in particular, not just showing little snide faces, but specifically rhetorically throwing athletes like him under the bus. We've seen him with John Jones. We've seen him with Demetrius Johnson, who they ultimately gave away for the equivalent of a sack of potatoes, even though he was marketable enough to be sponsored by Microsoft and is arguably the greatest fighter in the world. We've seen it with Anderson Silva. These are all black athletes that I'm mentioning. We've seen it with Tyron Woodley, people that are outspoken against the UFC and were black. And so that's the kind of framing that I would put to it.
Talk more about Dana White. Like, what's his deal?
All right, so he's an interesting character. He first came on the scene with the UFC in around, I think, 2001, when two high school friends of his, Lorenzo and Frank Fertitta, who were heirs to the Station Casino of Nevada company, when he became president of the UFC, when they bought the UFC. Now, that itself is an interesting story because the UFC has been around since 1993, and they faced a lot of regulatory hurdles. They were operating really outside of regulation, not illegally per se, but without, in a gray area where athletic commissions hadn't really decided they needed to regulate them for a while. And then people like Senator John McCain, who was a big, let's just call him a boxing booster, came out on national television and called it human cockfighting, which is philosophically and grammatically an interesting phrase. I don't know what that means exactly, but the idea was that it was super brutal. And this is a counterfactual type of Western idea of mixed martial arts that we've seen disproven by actual science, even as early as like 2006, Johns Hopkins University, the study of deaths and serious injuries, and they found it to be a less dangerous sport in terms of head trauma, spinal trauma, and death than things like football, American football, even soccer and stuff like that. So it was banned from terrestrial or from cable television, and the old owners, one of the old owners of the UFC said, you know what, we have to run towards regulation. We need this to be sanctioned so we can have this stamp of approval. Let's change our marketing away from this underground thing and go towards it. So they went to one of the biggest, if not the biggest, athletic commission that you can go to for their seal of approval in the start of the century, the Nevada State Athletic Commission, and it was rejected. And one of the biggest, most vocal opponents of them becoming sanctioned at the time on the athletic commission was one Lorenzo Fertitta. When they got rejected, the value of that company went way, way down. Lorenzo and Frank Fertitta, his brother, ended up going in and buying it. He left the athletic commission after the value of the company had been dropped because of his own regulatory power. Purchased it. They put in their friend Dana White in as president, and they took over in, I think, 2000, 2001, if I'm not mistaken. Dana White was run out of, by his own reports and some corroborating stuff, was run out of his home of Boston because he refused to pay street tax to Whitey Ford, or was it Whitey Bulger, excuse me, back in the day. And he ends up then becoming close friends with people like Donald Trump to start getting things going in Atlantic City, in New Jersey. Lorenzo Fertitta, all of a sudden the UFC with Lorenzo Fertitta and Frank Fertitta as owners had no problem getting sanctioned in Nevada, so they started being able to be regulated again. Dana White's personal friendship with Donald Trump continued. He endorsed him publicly, even gave speeches, at least at the 2016 Republican National Convention. His partners at the time, Lorenzo and Frank Fertitta, the owners who put him in, Station Casinos, which they own, is one of the most anti-union casino companies in Nevada. Many of the biggest casinos in Nevada, these aren't like nice organizations, but they do business with unions, right? And their people down from the housekeepers up, they're unionized. But Station Casino has always fought that, which actually created a really interesting situation out in your neck of the wood, Matt, when the UFC tried to get sanctioned in New York. We had the Culinary Workers Union oppose it big time, and they didn't really care about mixed martial arts per se, but it was a proxy battle happening against station casinos at the time because of stuff happening in Nevada. That ownership left. They sold for billions upon billions of dollars about was it 6 years ago, 6 or 7 years ago, and now they're part of what's now a publicly owned company, which is headed by Ari Emanuel, brother of our former mayor here in Chicago, where I am, Rahm Emanuel, and supposedly the basis for all sorts of fictional heroes that we've seen on shows like Entourage. And although they certainly do business with guilds and unions because they represent a bunch of like Hollywood clients, they really like the margins, the profit margins that this company that they purchased had, because the athletes, the labor in this instance, have such a low percentage of revenue share of the revenue. And they also get a lot of their costs underwritten now by their broadcast partners, now ESPN, previously Fox Sports, where I used to work, and a bunch of other corporate 500 and corporate 100 companies that the athletes don't get any share in, or when they do get shares, it's not any type of it's not a structured deal that they had a seat at the table at. So Dana White in particular has always been part of this anti-labor ownership. He is used as kind of a bludgeon against the fighters, even though he's a promoter. The only times you'll ever see him really bash fighters, and he does it frequently, is usually when there are people that speak out against the practices, either always or selectively. He's done that against some of the biggest stars. He'll excuse Conor McGregor, assaulting people and threatening people's children and wives. But when Conor McGregor said he wasn't getting paid enough, then he had a problem with him. He'll excuse John Jones hitting a pregnant woman with a car and fleeing the scene and being caught with drugs, or being caught using cocaine during a training camp, which is kind of badass if you think about it. But he'll excuse that. But when John Jones complains about matchmaking, complains about almost criminal things that the UFC is doing, or criminally low pay, or wants to hold out for more money, then they throw him under the bus. So Dana White is himself personally really a right-wing figure, and at the helm of a company that likes to think of itself as liberal, though in a sense, like most of their workers that are actually employees, like in PR or in the front office, like to think of themselves as good liberals and tolerant and things of that nature. But Dana White, all the way from his business practices, all the way down to the rhetoric he uses, and the rhetoric he allows, is pretty right wing, even down to just base, crude, sexist, homophobic things he says, and certainly a lot of anti-labor stuff.
Yeah, I mean, that's just to underscore for folks. That's atypical that a sports league would not have a union. NFL, MLB, NBA, they all have unions. We actually talked with Waz about how the NBA one was formed, and very righteous struggles. So that's interesting. Let's talk a little bit about this is sort of related, how people are reacting to say you quote one guy that called the winner a jackass. He was acting like a jackass, as we in the context of McGregor, right? Talk a little bit about this culture being developed towards like media, basically, and also the relationship that media has with the sport itself officially.
Yeah, that's a great question. It's like to answer it, it's like a matrix of different things, but I think they're relatively connected. If we take the culture of how the UFC seems to want its fans to consider and regard the beat media that covers it, and consider and regard its athletes and their pay and their requests. I think those things are pretty well connected. So you've got this historically anti-union ownership that we've seen for at least the last 20 years. We've got, including this new ownership, which is not necessarily anti-union with its other endeavors, but likes these margins that you could only see with a labor force that is not collectively bargaining. And then you've got a grooming of what can only degenerate. I mean, this is gonna. I mean, people are gonna be upset at me. I've covered boxing and international MMA since 2006 for a living, but what could only be described in regards to the MMA beat media as a semi-professional beat media. Those who can't just be kind of groomed and brought along by little things like access to live events, and I've gone and covered events live, UFC live events since 2006, are often outright hired by the UFC, often secretly. The biggest media personality in all of MMA had a secret UFC contract while he was ostensibly working for a completely different outlet, which is owned by Vox Media. Had a secret UFC contract that ultimately came to light, and that's just its own interesting story that I was very important witness to, pretty close. They're also just bribed some of the biggest names in the sport secretly as well, either by flying them out, paying for them to cover events, or co-opting their media outlets that they represent with ad buys or underwriting expenses secretly, some of which is entirely legal, but dubious. So you've got a pliable press that is browbeaten in what they usually treat as an access kind of based coverage sphere. So most of the media likes to get their quotes and their information, as do a lot of other beats. You'll see this in city councils everywhere. If you've got a strong executive that likes to browbeat, on one end, browbeat the media and humiliate them in front of their colleagues. Literally, Dana White does this. Chicago mayors do this. Press secretaries and presidents do this. Embarrass them on one hand, and then on the other hand, close to deadline, will feed them information. You get a pliant media, even if they weren't being bribed outright, right? You set the tone, even if they weren't kind of like self-selected to be like right-thinking individuals, as Noam Chomsky talks about. You've got a pliant media that is really willing to, especially as the sport grew and became really hot, and there was money to be made, willing to advance whatever narrative, eager to advance whatever narrative was kind of fed to them. And they also, again, the semi-professional part, not that professional media covering other beats in the world are immune from this, but they just really lack in a lot of critical thinking. They hadn't, most of the media covering fights haven't covered other things. And so they really don't have a sense of where they should be, some basic journalistic principles and where they should be questioning. And you also have an overall culture in the sport of MMA which relates to this, where it's time to outgrow this mentality that we've also, in the community at large, we've had of like MMA, before it was even called MMA, it was called NHB or Vale Tudo, is like this mom and pop operation. It's underground, besieged by everyone. So we all have to band together so that it survives, so that we can keep doing it. And that's cool, but unhealthy attachments to some of these authority figures and this idea that we're all in it together kind of lead to a press and fans not being willing to question the authority figures that happen to be tamping down on labor rights. And then it's a microcosm of what we've seen in a lot of other sports, where the athletes, who some of them might be millionaires, are framed as greedy, but the billionaire ownership, they're the ones being taken advantage of. We see this in a lot of sports. I think we see this exacerbated when the athletes are black, and sometimes you see this in with the way that people discuss the NBA, like in the 70s, or before the new collective bargain, or the new like salary cap in '98 in the NBA, like when Kevin Garnett got a big contract. We see all this talk of a coded language of entitlements and stuff like that. And while we don't have majority black league, so to speak, in the UFC, we actually have something that I think in the inverse is extra dangerous, where the biggest stars are usually white, the ones that are promoted. And so when the athletes are not white, and when they're black or they're brown, and they start speaking out against these things, you already have a fan base that is right wing for the most part. You see this in the gym membership, people that participate in it and then become fans. The people that like Dana White himself, because he's promoted himself as a star more than any other any other of the athletes, arguably, they're really primed to kind of go against anything that the athletes say they need and say, hey, you know what, we need to just be all this together and support the UFC, even though the UFC is now, billions of dollar industry itself.
Could you talk a little bit, just for folks who might not be familiar with how this all works? Because I really liked what you were saying about how there's a kind of, small business, or as, mom and pop businesses like to say, we're all family, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Kind of mentality in the sport. I mean, could you talk about, some of like the particular labor issues that, are extra striking, and maybe if you have any examples of some of the things that maybe Sterling has sort of tried to bring to attention to that's created this backlash?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So one of the things that jumps out in terms of the we're all family stuff is that as president, Dana White has basically used that type of language. And he has said explicitly, and different labor struggles have come up with certain athletes trying to negotiate for new contracts. He basically says explicitly he doesn't like athletes having managers. He doesn't want to even deal with managers. He wants to. So not only do they not have union membership or association membership, where they get a seat at the table to negotiate royalties for things like action figures and video games and apparel, and then have like forensic auditing ability to see what's actually been sold. Not only do they not have any of that, not only do they not have any seat at the table to negotiate royalty rates for all these gigantic corporate sponsorships or anything like that. They also, the UFC has made it clear that they don't really want to hear from certain managers. There's the UFC heavyweight champion of the world was actually put in a scab fight. There's a lot of these scab fights, especially happening in the last few years since the new ownership took over, where a reigning champion can't come to terms with the UFC on either the timing of when they're going to fight, how much they're going to fight for, and the UFC, because they have their own belts. They basically serve as their own sanctioning body when it comes to titles, not in terms of athletic commissions and things like certain things, although they effectively sanction themselves with drug testing. They do the same with titles, something which is illegal against federal law in boxing, according to because of the Ali Act, which I think passed in 2001. The UFC basically has control of these symbolic titles, but that have real material consequences. Because, for example, an athlete that's trying to get an endorsement on their own, they have a much better position when they and their manager, they and their agent are trying to negotiate for a deal to say, I'm the champion. So in any case, they've been putting on these fights. There was the previous champion before this guy, Francis Ngannou, couldn't come to terms with the UFC on when he was going to fight next. Like, I'm injured, I can't fight now. How about we fight then? The UFC said, no, screw you. We own the titles. We're putting what's called an interim title bout together. So they effectively strip him of this, right? No sanctioning body overseeing it. They just do that. Francis Ngannou gets put in. They market him in a very stereotypical, one-dimensional way as a scary, gigantic black monster. He's a terrifying and amazing, like terrifying in terms of his fighting ability, a really warm guy in reality, but just a really amazing knockout fighter. They put him in there. He wins. Then all of a sudden he says, you know what? I want to like control my schedule when I fight and for how much I fight a little better. And the types of, I want to get a percentage of the pay-per-view. And they said, you know what? No, we're not going to do that. You have to fight at this time against this person. So the UFC controls the time you fight, who you fight. There's no rankings that determine automatic contenders. The UFC has its own official rankings that they use. Actually, the people that vote for the rankings are media members that they choose. Years ago, I turned down a spot on that because I thought it was a fraught situation. And then they, even when the media, for example, has certain people ranked a certain place, the UFC can come in and unilaterally switch things up. They've done this with Nate Diaz, a big star, when he was negotiating. They just dropped him from the rankings, contrary to the old rules that were supposed to govern it. So Francis Ngannou now has found himself, they took his title away. He came back, he fought, he won it, and now they're taking it away and doing another interim battle. Francis Ngannou, I say all that to say this, Francis Ngannou is represented by one of the biggest, an agent that is not just a manager, but a licensed agent who works for one of the biggest agencies in Hollywood. And Dana White has come on explicitly, another black man, by the way. Francis Ngannou is black, and from the African continent, and his agent is a black American. And Dana White's saying, this guy doesn't know what he's talking about. And Ngannou is not well served by this representation. They do that a whole lot. Now, some of the issues that come up are things like, when do I get to fight? The doctor says I'm injured. I can't fight until this point. Who do I get to fight? I don't want to fight this guy. I want to fight this guy. Do I get more money, not just in base salary? The UFC fighters typically get a certain amount of money in their contracts to show, and if they win, it's oftentimes doubled. So it's a really, really like precarious position they're in. Some of the top fighters negotiate to have a percentage of the pay-per-view. Their biggest fights are put on a pay-per-view basis, where you pay like a really big fee as a fan to watch a certain card, as opposed to the ones that are offered on cable or streaming services. So they have no real control over that. Fighters have left, including like this one guy, Quinton Rampage Jackson. He left mad because he said, you know what? I haven't received a single dollar in royalty check. And I'm one of the biggest stars. You sell action figures with my name. I'm in video games and all, you sell gear with my name on it. And I don't receive royalty. That checks out. Most fighters, if you ask them, have not received a royalty check. And he said, there's no forensic device for me to look into. The UFC says, oh, you haven't. I have no ability with my managers to go in, and I have no forensic auditing ability. So there's some there's people that are upset about that. Obviously, there's people that are upset about the way that they're promoted. They say, you know what, you don't promote me well. There used to be a time UFC was growing in this mom and pop zone where they said, you know what, we don't pay that much. At the time, there was a point where other MMA organizations paid more. They said, we don't pay that much, but when you come to the ring, you can have a banner. You can hang it behind you. When they show you, it'll list all your sponsors. And you can go out there, because after all, the UFC considers these folks independent contractors. They avoid paying any employment rights or paying into any employment taxes by characterizing them independent contractors. And so fighters used to do that. They would hustle from a low end, things like Condom Depot, all the way to the top end. A fighter named Demetrius Johnson had a sponsorship from Xbox, from Microsoft. Then they cut that off. They say, you know what? No, we have an official deal with Reebok to outfit you. So even though you're independent contractors and we decide when you fight, we can cut you if you decide not to fight or accept certain fights at certain times. And the exclusivity that you have to us, you're not free to sign with other fighters and other organizations, even if you're a huge star like Conor McGregor. Conor McGregor had to give the UFC a piece of his fight when he fought Floyd Mayweather. Dana White probably made as much as Conor McGregor personally when they fought Floyd Mayweather. Yeah, so they manage effectively as management and as promoters, which in boxing can get as illegal. So there's these types of fights that have over there. Fighters want a bit more control over their working conditions, their benefits, and salary. Fighters don't have pensions. They're not even eligible, possibly, right? In the amount of years you might be eligible for pension. They're never eligible for that. So these are just some of the issues that some of the fighters are upset about.
That's a remarkable amount of power for over fighters. Like, it's like they privatized the Roman gladiator thing.
No, that's exactly right. We talked to labor attorneys for stories and when they look at some of these contracts, they're like, this looks like a freaking early 20th century baseball contract. This is absurd. It's actually the type of contracts that are being struck down, or the type of relationships that are being struck down in California with like the Uber class action suit, right? To characterize people as independent contractors when you require like an employee level of commensurate responsibility.
Oh shoot! Looks like we
might have frozen him. Well, maybe while you're figuring that out, I mean, I was just like, I'm no like employment lawyer or anything like that, but basically controlling what people wear when they fight, right? Basically controlling their schedule, controlling whether or not they're able to, display their sponsors, whatever. I mean, in any other context, that would be, regarded as, as an employee, right? Like if you have to wear a uniform that is given to you by your employer, I mean, you are an employee. The independent contract thing is bogus from the get-go, but like even on the most baseline ways that they usually try to investigate that, the UFC is already showing, they're very clearly, in defiance of the law there.
Yeah, it's such a microcosm of the economy in general. Like you mentioned, like the gig economy parallels. And there's also you can fight for exposure, right? You will have a big banner where you can do the corporate sponsors that you go out and get take care of. So I'm not sure if we'll have Elias back. We might have some internet issues. What do you want to do in the meantime, David? Is there
Well, why don't we just take a 1 minute break, see if we can get him back. If not, we'll
cool?
move on. All right. Does that sound
Right.
good to everybody? Sorry about that.
Yeah. All right, folks. Looks like we got Elias back there.
Hey, sorry guys, we had a little brown out here. I'm using my phone now. Hopefully the audio isn't bad. I apologize.
All good.
No
all
worries,
good.
man. Appreciate it.
Of course.
I think when we lost you, we were just sort of wrapping up just like how insane it is that, they're considering these people to be independent contractors, despite the fact that they're controlling what they wear. And you and Matt were noting the similarity there between, like early, like 19th century baseball contracts.
Truly, it's really astounding in this modern era, and I think this I mean, I think your listeners appreciate if I put it well enough, but this really goes to the problem of capitalism, in my view. There was in the community, this tight knit community, the MMA community that we were talking about. There was always this idea that once it broke through, once we got on network television, once we got on cable, once there was real money, then we're basically, once the productive capabilities of this sport were unleashed, you know what? It's going to be good then. In reality, it's not really a matter of productive capabilities or popularity. Just like it's not a matter of capitalism's productive abilities. Capitalism is extremely productive. It's a matter of distribution. And if you create a lot of wealth, but you don't account for the way things are distributed, it doesn't mean there's going to be any more equity or any more fairness. It's really sad.
Totally. I mean, like, no, and I mean, like, I tell people all the time, I mean, media, obviously people aren't fighting, but people who try to get into like journalism in these kind of contexts, it can be tough, especially people trying to get into like left stuff, because, it is true that a lot of these publications and organizations, they don't have a lot in the ways of funding, right? I've had to do work for free in the past, and, sometimes that sort of panned out for me in the future, but more often than not, it didn't. But it just, like, I don't know, it's like a bit of like personal advice. Like, you got to be really careful about these things, because even when the money starts rolling in, it always has a funny way of never finding the people who were promised, that they would be taken care of on the back end.
And the insane thing about that is just of all sports to not be in control of things like who your opponents are going to be, right? Like the non-compensation forms of authority and power at a workplace is like to have to fight like on a day that you don't feel like it. Like that's something people should be free to choose when they're willing to do that.
Right? Isn't that crazy? And when fights fall through, they'll quick to get they're like, because of injury or illness, they're quick to get last minute replacements, even like in a day or two's notice. You don't even see that in boxing. And boxing is incredibly exploitative. And the people that have to fall out, they don't get compensated, or if they do, it's at the discretion or the management.
Yeah.
Well, unless there's anything else that you want to note, I was curious to maybe move over to politics a little bit and talk about this Chris Smalls AOC saga. I mean, we've talked about it a bit on the program here. I mean, my top line thing on this is I think that people, especially like in our audience, people who are watching these things, really need to stop putting media lens on like political and social events. And I think one of the things that's really frustrating about, I think I'll just say, in case maybe somebody's watching this and they don't know what we're talking about, Chris Smalls wins an incredibly historic, organizing push against one of the nastiest corporations in the globe. And afterwards, he's asked a few times by folks, about AOC, and he noted that they had events that were scheduled with her, and that she sort of bowed out. And then they said, well, we're not going to continue to sort of embarrass ourselves by promoting events for her to not show up. And from all this, like, there's been a lot of people who are like, oh well, Chris Smalls has now been like co-opted by like the Looney Tunes or things like that. And then I just set this all up and hear your thoughts on it, Elias. And then another chapter of this too happened where he went on Tucker Carlson, reaching, and we all know who Tucker Carlson is, but reaching a massive kind of audience here. And Tucker Carlson really trying to make a presentation to people that he had Chris Smalls on his program to talk about why the left is bad, and why AOC is a traitor and all this kind of stuff. And if you actually watch the clip, in my opinion, Chris Smalls does an incredible job of not taking any of the bait, and really sticking to the script and saying, like, this is the way forward, and articulating a really, really passionate and compelling. And I can imagine a lot of people who were watching that who might, be conservative, maybe, if you were to ask them, but they're working people, might be compelled to see how this kind of collective organizing works. But I've said enough on my opinions on. I'm really curious what what you think about this whole thing, Elias.
Yeah, no, I think this has been fascinating to watch. Up front, I think the types of people that have attacked Chris Smalls for his not even real criticism of Representative says, but simply his insisting on the fact that this work has been done by the union and not by elected officials like her, shows that she's been co-opted entirely, in my view. You don't get defended by these types of establishment, Democrat Party figures and mainstream liberals unless you've been co-opted. If she was truly some revolutionary boogie woman, they would just let them fight it out if there was any real fighting to be had. And then, the rest of the types of stuff is, it veers from, racist and classist condescension to true, racist classist hatred of someone like Chris Smalls, is suggesting that, he's basically going to be taken advantage of and be a useful idiot for someone like Tucker Carlson or for an outlet like Fox News. Again, it really belies how little respect they have for actual working class leaders who are winning victories that the liberal establishment has either never delivered for working class people or hasn't delivered in years. And you're right, if you watch the clip, he is what he's been showing himself to be, a classic pro who is able to get his message across, stay on topic that he wants to stay on, and really ignore any of the type of bad faith steering that his host tried to put in there. Because of course, Chris Smalls knows that they're bringing him on there. The whole
I know.
Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Democrats and so-called progressives hypocrisy. Of course, he knows that, but he's able to avoid it. Which, by the way, like, the fact that it's being delivered in bad faith and the fact that it's done without self-awareness or acknowledged self-awareness doesn't mean that on its face, Tucker Carlson is wrong about progressives and liberals being completely hypocritical and not actually what they claim to be. Of course, that's right. Neither is Tucker Carlson what he claims to be, right? Like now he's supposed to be a right-wing populist and things of that nature. Fine, the guy has soft hands and a hard brain, but so he's not what he claims to be either. But Chris Smalls was not going to be taken advantage of, and he did what he should be as a representative for working people and people trying to unionize who have indeed successfully unionized. You still got to fight it out, unfortunately, some more. He took their message and took it to everywhere. He put it everywhere. He took it to the widest audience possible, made a really good argument. Even he did some jiu-jitsu. He got Tucker Carlson, who is no friend of the working man and woman, who is, no friend of labor, to make the argument himself that, hey, you know what? I'm rooting for you guys. I hope you do organize in Amazon, and Amazon needs some counterbalance. He got a corporate hack to say that corporations need to be held accountable by working people because of his rhetorical jiu-jitsu. So yeah, it's super condescending. It's super repugnant, and I think it shows who these types of folks are. But I will say this: I think it's really, really promising, and I think it's exactly the right approach, and really cool to see people who do direct action and actual organizing, as opposed to the organizing that, like a representative of Ocasio-Cortez highlighted on her Instagram the other week when she politely asked Joe Biden to please consider forgiving student loan debt. She called that organizing. It's not organizing at all, right? Like, I'm not an organizer either, but that isn't organizing. To have someone like Chris Smalls go out there and make this argument of the widest possible audience. I mean, I think it was rhetorically convincing, and furthermore, it shows that the path forward isn't really through electoralism, and isn't really through like us being able to match lobbying efforts with corporations. It's actually just by doing the work ourselves, by organizing one another, and that's how these battles are won. And I think that's a great step forward. Whomever it is, whether it's Ocasio-Cortez, whether it's Donald Trump, Joe Biden, or Senator Sanders, our hope can't be vested in them. That's just maybe one part of an overall strategy.
Well, just to, put my cards on the table, like, the real tension with AOC, and we've said this, I've said this many times on the program, is that, she came out of an organization, DSA, that had, just seen a massive spike in membership post Bernie Sanders. And, we had Natalie Scher on the program who wrote a really good piece, I think, in Jacobin about AOC and the left. And one thing that I think is worth noting is that, and I don't think that this is necessarily cynical, but it's just a fact, that she wasn't really a member of the organization for a long time beforehand, which nobody was really. But what I mean by that is, like, somebody gets propelled onto the national stage to sort of be seen as a figurehead or a leader of something that of a movement that, like, she certainly has some roots in, but they aren't as developed, right? And I think a lot of the tensions that you see with AOC, and even with people who are members of the DSA, which is a constant fight that's going on. This is like every week there's something on this. I think that really does. Show, like, it's not to be cliche, but there's a little bit of a consequence of your own success. Like, you put together a campaign that, unseats like a extremely powerful, entrenched, Democratic Party leader. But then you also catapult somebody who's, again, I don't think that, I don't want to sit here and say necessarily that it's cynical as much as it's like, there's a lack of discipline that comes out of the fact that, like, somebody was only sort of partially in the organization, and no one really was thinking actually about the capacity 5 years down the line, how we're going to be able to discipline and deal with members of these kind of organizations. Right. You see these things really, really publicly, and they're damaging. And, I don't think it's worthwhile to spend all of her time sort of getting worked up about, like, AOC as if, like, she's the one who's sort of standing in between us and genuine progress. But as you were saying, it is an example that, like, no, there is not going to be any kind of savior delivered to us from up high. It's going to have to come from, mass mobilization. And that, as I said at the beginning of the show, to Bernie Sanders' credit, that was always like a big theme of his campaign, though I don't think people took it as seriously materially. I think a lot of people saw it as like a rhetorical flourish, But Bernie Sanders, when he's saying, like, I need you guys to do the things that we're talking about, I think people were like, yeah, he means that we're all in this together. He's like, no, like, literally, if I'm in power, like, I need you guys to be able to have some capacity to force people to the negotiating table.
Yeah, right. And people, I think that's like illegible to a lot of folks, as the parameters of what is considered acceptable political participation is
Yes.
long generation been really narrowed to electoralism, and after real radicals were purged from, like, mainstream labor, it's gotten worse and worse. So you're right. I think a lot of people turn it seriously. Maybe especially too because Barack Obama kind of said similar-ish things, and clearly didn't mean it or didn't follow through on it. But yeah, no, I think that's well put.
Yeah, I think, like, the main cultural deficiency I think we're experiencing here is that this whole exchange should have been greeted like De Niro in that gif where he's like, yes, like, this is the type of pressure and sort of tension you want between labor organizers and politicians. And instead, everyone felt very, very fragile, and as if we need to, like, suppress whatever's going on here. And look at where we actually are. Bernie's coming down to visit them on Sunday, right? Like, so, like, all the, like, pearl clutching and just, like, like, especially when we're being led by actual workers that are getting results like this, people need to take a step back and, let them cook a little bit.
It's a real misapprehension of what politics is, right? And it's just substituting our elites for their elites or their elites. It's like,
Mm-hmm.
it's not really about holding power accountable. It's about getting the people whose personality we like in power. Then we have to be polite to them, and it's just absurd. There's no real evidence of showing how that works or that produces any change. But people really get caught up in the aesthetic of certain ideas or movements instead of like historicizing what produces results, and that becomes probably a really tricky thing to navigate when there's a breakthrough in the acceptability to even say certain words in a less than negative sense, like socialism. It's like, oh, this is great, we can talk about it now, but then how much is the term degraded? I'm not saying about contested, because these terms are always contested, right? What is anarchism? What is socialism? We're always going to argue about that, and that's fine. But like the potency can become degraded, because if they're becoming legible in the mainstream, there's this extent where they're going to be just co-opted into the way things work with everything else.
Totally. And one of the phrasings that we like to use sort of after 2020 was something we're borrowing from Leo Panich, who's borrowing from somebody else whose name is escaping me right now. But it's the difference between, and this is really what, if you want to call it left populist or whatever, sometimes those terminologies can be a little fuzzy, but moment, right? All the way from 2010 to 2020, all across the globe, you saw these kind of new movements, reinvigorated, and it was certainly exciting. It was worth doing. But there was it's called class focused instead of class rooted. And what that means is like you're saying things and genuinely probably even mean them, that like, we want to do this, we want this kind of policy and that kind of policy. But until you're actually rooted inside of the class and the time of the working class, you're not going to be successful at trying to overtake, again, these kind of entrenched powers. Because I hate to sit here and people think that I'm just sort of lecturing on this, but we have a lot of history of successful electoral movements, not just in the United States, but around the globe, of like social democratic movements that did a lot of good things. But you see what happens, they get rolled back. And that's what happens when you're sort of class focused, because like you might be able to beat a kind of weakened or disorganized capitalist class at a particular moment in history. But unfortunately, what we've learned from, 200 plus years of struggle now is that they always are able to sort of recalibrate, co-opt and sort of pull back on these things. So, I think that understanding this on a strategic and material level is really important, instead of like a moral level where I think a lot of people operate. And I don't necessarily mind it, because hell, I get pissed off too, as much as the next guy. But like, when people talk about, for example, social democracy, they talk about it almost as if it's like a spiritual force that sort of is going to, taint you and destroy you, instead of what we actually have learned from history is that a lot of these things are extremely well-intentioned and they've helped people. But there's a cap as to how much they can do. And more importantly, there's a lack of permanency in a lot of these changes. I mean, hell, in this country, you were seeing Bernie Sanders basically trying to reinvigorate a New Deal project that was sort of abruptly ended in this country. And again, a hell of a lot better than Obama-style neoliberalism, but a limited horizon. And like, we can't fall into the trap of playing that game over and over and over again. And also for people who might already be convinced of that, though, you need to start thinking about these things, in my opinion, much more materially and strategically, rather than, I don't know, I've read the right thing and I know that social democracy is a slur instead of like, a positive thing, which you see a lot from people on Twitter. And I just don't find that necessarily to be particularly helpful. Right. And, because you could see, I mean, like, it was amazing to see all the different kinds of things that people were taking out of the Chris Smalls moment. Right. Because while he did come at AOC, being a good organizer, And he came at AOC and politicians in general, being an organizer and all this other stuff. He also recognized that, there can be good here. So what do you say? Like, this is a marathon, not a sprint. People can always redeem themselves, right? So he's leaving the door open if the people who are in power want to show up and do things as you're seeing right now going on with Bernie Sanders, which I think is extremely, it's something to be hopeful about. Understand that too. I guess I hate to be like both sides in these things, but understand that too, because it's also important, to not just be like, well, I have the right critique and now I just get to sit down. Because, we've had the right critique for a long time. A lot of people have had their critique for a long time. And the point really is to start to change things. Matt, did you want to play this clip?
Yeah, so I do have a clip here that kind of illustrates a little bit of the problem we're dealing with. Our buddies over at The Lever have this video out about a guy named Brad Langer. And, it explains it pretty well in the video here, so I'll just I'll play it for us here. And this sort of illustrates the tension we have with sort of the squad right now.
Through smart investments, I'll help rebuild a more equal economy.
Brad Lander billed himself as an up-and-coming progressive Democrat, campaigning for New York City's powerful controller's office on a promise to challenge Wall Street and the fossil fuel industry. But within months of taking office, he's pushing to give himself the authority to funnel more than $27 billion of workers' retirement savings to Wall Street, specifically to shadowy private equity firms and hedge funds, which often pump the money into fossil fuel investments.
Controller's office is a team of about 700 people. We're already spending that money and we need to spend it wisely as well. But the goal is to get a big return on that money by finding good places to save.
While only 16% of the city's largest pension fund is currently invested in private equity and real estate, other high-risk investments have likely caused the fund to nearly reach its maximum under the basket clause, which is probably why Lander is pushing to increase that limit from 25 to 35%.
I would like to discuss one legislative priority that impacts our ability, the ability of our public pension funds to deliver for our public sector retirees. We need the legislature to modernize Section 177 of the Retirement and Social Security Law, known as the Basket Clause. That law, established in 1960 in a dramatically different investment context, hampers our ability to prudently diversify our portfolio.
During his controller campaign, Lander received more than $115,000 in contributions from the finance, insurance, and real estate sector. Much of that haul was subject to generous campaign matching funds from the city of New York, increasing the impact of the donations. If Lander's proposed change goes through, it could fleece thousands of pensioners with huge fees and weak returns, while making Wall Street fat cats even richer.
So, I mean, it's just interesting in the context. It shows where we are, this post AOC moment. AOC, they're in a campaign ad with this guy. And the way they learn to speak the language of sort of some sort of equity and progressiveness, and then they get in and immediately do the Wall Street's bidding, literally.
It's when certain types of things become acceptable. It's just like any other claim. If certain terms or certain critical versions of philosophy start to catch on with the kids, then we have to, we have to worry, because just talking about it no longer, is a real good guarantee that people are going to follow through. I mean, running for office is a pretty good indicator that someone might not be pure.
Yeah, and I feel like Latin America has like Pink Tide and the sort of challenge to Pink Tide leaders is sort of maybe a little bit more advanced than us and sort of recognizing this a little bit, but yeah.
Well, I mean, no. I mean, I think that this whole chapter shows something that's very worrying. In general, people will sometimes get mad at us when we talk about what's going on with like the squad and its relationship to like the socialist movement, or even Chris Smalls. It's like, why aren't you talking about Mondaire Jones or this other kind of liberal politician or progressive politician? It's like, well, because I don't care about them. because I'm a socialist who is like looking to try to bolster and support our movement and hold people who are associated with it accountable. I have no expectations, or honestly, like desire, for these people to be, really showing up, because I know where they're going to take these things. I have a little bit, again, I'm not somebody who's sitting here waiting, for AOC to sort of, shift into, a much more radical candidate. But there's at least like, okay, well, there's some expectation that I can have of this person here, right? So that's why we talk about these people, because, we might not like agree totally. We have a hell of a lot of criticisms, but these are the people who we need to have showing up and doing things if we're going to continue to let these things, allow these things to grow, these movements to grow.
That's the next step, right? That makes sense. It's like if you agree to elect people based on the rhetoric and the language that they use that seems amenable to you and your philosophies, good. That's the start. The next part is to then, be vigilant and critical of them to make sure that they stick to that. So they can not mean those words. That's fine by me. But so long as we try to keep them accountable. But that's the part that I think folks are so uncomfortable with, because we're really, we just get I don't know. I guess they didn't read the Federalist Papers. But like, once we find the right angels and put them in office, that's it. That's all right. It doesn't work that way.
Yeah.
No, I mean, it's too bad, because that'd be a hell of a lot easier. Well, Elias, I really appreciate you coming in and joining us and talk about UFC and all of this. I mean,
That's fascinating.
It's always great. It's always great hanging out with you, man.
Oh, the pleasure is mine. Thank you so much for the conversation, gentlemen.
For sure. And folks, if you go down the show notes, we have all the ways to find Elias online and Elias's work, and we'll hope to do this again sometime soon, brother.
Yep.
Looking forward to it. Thank you.
Yep. See you, man.
See ya.
Take care. Yeah,
all
man.
Right. That's fascinating. That deal about the. I just want to say real quick, the thing about the. I'm going to be on this Nevada Sports Commission and deny your request, but then go buy you. Like, that's like, I don't know if people watch Gilded Age on HBO. I've dabbled a little bit, but it's like that old fashioned style corruption. Like, that's insane.
No, totally. Yeah, no, I mean, like, everything that you're seeing in the UFC is, a pretty good encapsulation of what happens with capital. I mean, Dana White is sort of a perfect kind of embodiment of that mentality, from the we're all a family bullshit to to waging war on his employees because he doesn't want he doesn't want some of them to succeed. It's something else. Well, we got two more stories to get to before we run over the post game. Should we start with this Twitter bit?
Yes, let's do it.
So, y'all, I know everybody's been watching this for a little while, and this is, we're going to talk a little bit about Elon Musk's attempt to sort of take over Twitter, but we want to feed y'all too and start to get to some of the good stuff as to what this sort of shows about the way that American capitalism has been functioning, for the past 50 years or so. But I mean, maybe just to set the table for people who have been following this, Musk, one of the ugliest glorified government contractors out there, has been trying to buy Twitter. And it should be noted that, this is somebody who really does rely on his perception, because so much of the companies that he's running don't actually produce the amount of actual goods to sort of match their valuation. I mean, Tesla produces, when you compare Tesla to a company like GMC or Ford or Toyota, it's not producing vehicles on any kind of level like those actual, those like more established car companies. And this isn't to sit around and say that Ford and GMC and Toyota are necessarily, beautiful, shining examples of, global citizenship or anything like that. It's to show that there's a fundamental irrationality in the kind of financial casino that we're living in. And Musk understands that. He understands that it's very important for him to have a kind of brand, for people to see him as the future. So when people are investing money and, pumping up the price of the stocks of his companies, they're doing it because they have some kind of feeling that like this is the next big thing, right? So he understands that his image is everything, and like, you know, give him credit. Like he does this fairly well, despite the fact that he is constantly being exposed for being a complete fraud. And Twitter is no small part of his of his strategy here. And we can talk about some of the nasty moves that he's done here when he's been trying to buy Twitter, particularly hiding information in his filings so that he could, you know, make a pretty penny for himself. But let me just set this up for folks. He's been trying to buy Twitter. He bought something a little bit above 9% of the shares of the company, making him the largest single shareholder. And they initially were going to put him on the board. Almost immediately, he started acting a fool online about his new position. And you could tell that the people inside the company, particularly the board, were very worried about what that future was going to look like. So they got some of their more institutional investors, I think Vanguard, but I could be incorrect about that, to buy more stock, you know, to sort of increase their position. And have also announced, one, that Musk is not going to be on the board. And two, as Musk started to get more and more hostile, that he's basically trying to do what's called a hostile takeover of the company, basically trying to buy as many shares as possible so that he can be a kind of majority stakeholder there. They announced that they would do what's called a poison pill, which is where they would basically flood stocks into the company to prevent him from being able to get a majority share. So it's very clear now that the board of Twitter is trying to prevent Musk from coming in and taking over the company. And I want to talk more importantly about the financialization and this whole era of, you know, stock market capitalism. Before we get that, because, you know, Twitter is a very important and is used by so many people, source of information, a place where Matt and I think as much as we like to get off, spend a decent amount of time on. You know, do you have any thoughts on Musk trying to take over this company?
No, honestly, because my problem is like, okay, I assume that if Musk took it over, it would lead to problems that would be documentable, and I'd want to keep an eye on changes like that. At the same time, like, I mean, Jack Dorsey used to run this thing. I don't know who's running it now particularly, but I don't trust them either. So like the thing that's interesting to me though is I just wanted to circle back to what you said about Musk's model and what he does to inflate his stocks. It seems like there's so much of the particularly the tech economy that is that, right? Like, isn't Uber the same way? Like, I know it's a massive global company and probably gets really great revenues, but not to the extent that they're like sort of valued at. And like that, I don't know, like that sort of is that sort of speculative, where we have to live with these speculative wishes of venture capital, and they become a huge part of our society just because of the desires of investors. Oh,
Excuse me. Yeah. Totally. And like, this is one of the major shifts that you see in American capital that ends up becoming very important and has major consequences, particularly for workers, but also for the quality of the products that we get, and their sustainability. And like, why don't we go here? Because I think this is an important point to make. So Musk has now, one thing is worth noting, Twitter right now gets 86% of their profit comes from advertising, and another 14% from effectively selling your data, right? And it's a free product, and as you know, the old adage, if it's free, you're the product. And we'll get to maybe some ways that we could undermine that in the future. But Musk has basically been going on a storm, attacking the integrity of the company. Again, a company that I don't find has tremendous amounts of integrity, but he's not doing it to create a kind of free speech platform. Musk is somebody who has shown in every aspect of his life that this is somebody who is fervently against any kind of speech that is revealing the reality of the way that he runs his companies. He said he moved to Texas because he wanted to be in a state that had less regulations and was more business friendly. But he moved there because California was getting on to his abuse of employees. One, his egregious workers' rights policies. 2, his horrible environmental record. And a lot of people don't realize this with Tesla. Those plants are major pollutants. And 3, this extremely, extremely egregious example of, I don't know what other way to call it, but old 19th century style like racism. This lawsuit, we did a whole episode on it against about the way that they were treating Black employees at their facilities in California, including sequestering Black employees into a certain part of the facility, which they called the plantation, and a few other names that I just don't have the heart to repeat again. He moved because he was trying to get away from any kind of more exposure of the way that he is actually operating his companies. As we talked about too in Brownsville, he's basically with his politicians that he's effectively bought out has been harassing a young activist there with the full power of the state. As Matt alluded to at the beginning of the show, this is somebody who called someone who was rescuing children who were trapped in a cave a pedophile because he didn't want to use Musk's toy boat to do it. Right? Like Musk is not somebody who's particularly interested in free speech. He is somebody who wants to use all of the tools at his disposal to try to silence people. And particularly, what he does now is he tries to flood like the end zone effectively with kind of nonsense stories. Knows that if he tweets something outrageous, it will be the first thing that will be written about when it comes to Tesla, and always seems to be doing this when a rocket launch goes bad, or it turns out that a product that they were going to be launching is going to be delayed or is malfunctioned, etc. Right? Like he knows how to play this game, and I think he would be very, very happy to be in a position of power and at a company like Twitter that is, again, very, very crucial for his brand and for his bottom line, so that he
it's a
can
threat to his brand and bottom line, frankly. Yeah.
And okay, so let's talk about what this really, really exposes about modern kind of financial capitalism, because I think that some people aren't as familiar with this. And the game that Musk has been playing, I think, has been particularly cynical. So I'm not going to bring up the tweet here, but here it is quoted in an article. He's been making a big stink now because he's waging war on the board of Twitter, again, who are no angels. But he's been making this point lately that, Lord, where did it go? Oh, the Twitter board collectively owns almost no shares! ! Objectively, their economic interests are simply not aligned with the shareholders. And a lot of people see this, and of course, he has a sycophants who praise anything that he says. But this is a very revealing thing, not just about Musk, but the way that modern American capitalism sort of functions, right? Because a lot of people see something like that, it's like, well, Musk is just looking out for the normal guy. I'm gonna tell you right now, there are not very many normal people who are invested in Twitter from the get-go, right? But there's this kind of mentality, right, that the big mean board is trying to wage war on the poor defenseless shareholders. This has been a crucial kind of framing for financial capitalism to sort of wage war on all other forms of capitalists. And remember, I think it's important for socialists to understand too that capitalists have a general shared interest, but they compete with each other, and there are different sections of the capitalist class, and it's worth understanding who has the upper hand. Traditionally, the fight between the kind of financial capital was between financial capital and industrial capital, and I'll tell you right now which one won. It's been financial capital, and that has had incredible consequences for working people in particular, right? Because if you don't have as much of the people who are leading and controlling these companies invested in actual material production, right? The actual producing of goods and services that are consumed. You have people who want to use financialization and financial tricks to basically boost up their bottom line with no regard for the workers in the company, no regard for the products that they're selling. And this was a victory that came out of capitalist crisis. And I'll just put this up real quick so people can get what I mean. This is from a really great book that you should read if you haven't. It's a few years old, but it still paints Jesus Christ, a really great. Excuse me, Matt.
There you go.
Excuse me 1 second. This is from Doug Henwood's book. Why is this not working for me? Doug Henwood's book, After the New Economy from 2003. As the economy soured in the 1970s and with its profits and stock prices, stockholders woke from their passivity and demanded that the firms be run in their interests rather than that of managers or some broader good. As a result, the interests of managers and board members were supposed to be aligned with those of stockholders, a realignment guaranteed by replacing salaries with stock options. So the point here is that you see this big shift in American capital in the 70s, where people who are running the companies, their financial packages are directly tied to the price of the stock. So that is where they're deriving the most of their income from, and the most of their bounty from. And the idea for this was that it would mean that they would always be looking out for the shareholders above all else, right? And what this has meant is you've seen what happens after this. You see massive amounts of outsourcing. You see massive amounts of companies being completely gutted. You have people like former presidential candidate Mitt Romney, Bain's Capital, who do things like come into a company, completely gut it, and make incredible amounts of profit, right? A really, really negative kind of vampiric aspect of capital that is actually disruptive to production itself, right? It makes a profit for the people who are invested, but it has a net drag on our economy as a whole, and most certainly everyday workers. And this has been a shift that I think a lot of people don't understand, but it has been absolutely crucial in creating the kind of paradigm and world that we're living in today. So going back to the Twitter, fiasco, it's not necessarily saying that the board itself is some kind of group of, angels who are trying to look out for the common Twitter user. They're abusing you, and we'll talk in just a second about some ways that we could do something different regarding that. But it's that this kind of common sense wisdom that Musk is trying to lean on here, that regarding the price of the stock above all else, above even the service itself, is somehow a good, is completely erroneous, and shows and exposes a really, really dangerous, but also now dominant way of viewing the most popular form of production in this country, which is the corporation.
Yeah. I mean, I think that is a really interesting structural reason for me to pay attention to a story that I'll be honest, I wasn't that closely. I mean, I've just reached my capacity on Musk, right? Like it's like,
oh no, I mean, me totally. That's why I didn't want to focus on the drama.
Yeah.
But I saw that and it irked me because you could see, because he instructs so many people, because he has such a big influence on a lot of kind of impressionable folks, that it drives me crazy. Because again, the people who are the most excited about Musk, saying these kind of things are people who have no real skin in the game in the sense of themselves being, personal stockholders. But there's this kind of like little guy thing that Musk tries to play. One of the wealthiest people in the world tries to play, that he's just looking out for the mom and pop, mom and pa who are invested in Twitter stock, right? Which is complete bullshit. And it also is not necessarily a good thing for companies to be overly invested and looking for their shareholders above all else. But let's talk about, a way out of this. And it's not the only solution. It certainly is a building block, I think, in what we would like to do with a lot of these companies. But, people know this argument that, social media companies, you're the product. You create the value for them. You are the ones that are making all of this money for these companies. Why are you not, one, having more say in the way that they're run, and two, enjoying in some of the fruits of the content that you're producing for them? And a lot of really great work has been written on some different ways to kind of remodel and refashion these companies under kind of social democratic or even socialist model. And I think this video right here from former Greek finance minister and radical Yanis Varoufakis shows a pretty interesting way of thinking about some things that we could do in the meantime, in the short term, that I think you could actually create a lot of political support for, and could certainly do under the current paradigms here. But this is Varoufakis talking about some different models for the way that we could interact with these companies.
Take, for instance, the big tech companies, Google, Facebook, and so on. They make huge quantities of money from, effectively, your work. every time you search something on the Google engine, every time you post something on Twitter, on Facebook, you are contributing to the capital stock of that company. This is unique in the history of capitalism. Consumers are creating the capital stock, not only buying services. Actually, we don't buy services, they're free services. But we help build up the capital stock. Now, why shouldn't a percentage of the shares of that capital belong to the public? So the idea is to say to them, you want to operate in Europe? 10% of your shares will have to go into a trust fund. So every child has a trust fund, not only the rich kids. And effectively, this is not taxation. You have a certain amount of capital, a certain amount of shares, not you and me personally, but as a society. The dividends, the profits, flow into that fund, and then they are distributed to every person, because we all use those services. We are all subject to the internet and so on and so forth. So that's a fundamental difference. I think this is the way of the future.
Totally. And I mean, I think these kind of creative models were some of the better aspects of the way that many of us were thinking at the height of, that kind of left populist movement, both with Sanders and Corbyn in the UK, of how we can start to take back, so much of the power and the wealth that is, controlled by these companies, and start to find ways to direct it into social good, which will only, in my opinion, if these things are, were actually tried, increase for further and further support for more of these companies to be taken either completely public or under social control.
Yeah, and I think like a few other things could be forced on, and I wish I followed like the EU in what they're doing for like tech companies and stuff like that. But like,
yeah,
it seems to me that when you're served an advertisement, you should see what the advertiser saw when they decided to serve that to you. So like, what demographic information, what sort of search information, like that question of, is this thing listening to me, and is that why all of a sudden I'm getting like ads for this product or that product?
mm-hmm.
That should be a question that you can answer by clicking on the ad, in my opinion. And like that sort of stuff, like we should have ownership over what we're subjected to online, and I think the ads entirely should be like nationalized, basically. I don't know.
Totally. Well, we got one more thing to get to before we go over the post game. But remember, you can join us at the post game. You can get us voicemails. We'll leave it. Why don't we pop it up right here so people can get some in now? You can leave us a voicemail at 1-940-289-7234. And we will be listening to those in the post game. You get access to that patreon.com/leftreckoning. You get the post game, and you also get the bonus episodes as well. So be sure, if you've been liking the work and the conversation that we've been having, to not miss out on the other 2/3 of this program. It really is a lot of fun, and we try to make sure that we can get as much of this public facing as possible. But all of this support really does help us continue to expand and grow this program.
Absolutely.
Well, let's get to this story, Matt. It's tough because I don't have a nice spin. I usually try to find something that we can do about this, and the only thing we can really do here is continue to ratchet up pressure and not allow the kind of lies and deceit that, and particularly in America, and particularly with liberal America, have become so prominent. I'm talking about Julian Assange. Julian Assange is a journalist who the American government right now is trying to extradite to the United States so that they can torture him for exposing American war crimes. Today, a UK court ordered that Julian Assange will be extradited to the United States at the behest of Biden, following through on a Trump-era policy here. The UK Home Secretary, Priti Patel, who's a Tory, is sort of the last hurdle here, and she will be the one who will be signing off on Julian Assange to be brought into an American prison. And I know that there's some potential legal challenges that can be made, and I hope that they are made and explored fully. But it's looking more and more likely that Julian Assange will be brought into the United States again to be held in prison for exposing some of the most brutal American war crimes. Just to set the table again for folks, remember the UN Special Rapporteur on torture has said that these extradition this extradition attempt, would be a disaster, saying, quote, Assange will be exposed to a real risk of serious violation of his human rights, including his freedom of expression, his right to a fair trial, and the prohibition of torture and other cruel, inhumane, or degrading treatment or punishment. Agnes Callamard, Amnesty International Secretary General, said the extradition of Julian Assange would also be devastating for press freedom and for the public, who have a right to know what their governments are doing in their name, which is undoubtedly true. Remember, Assange has been in prison now, has not been freed, to walk around the streets, to live his life, to see his children outside of these particular confines that he's been in for nearly a decade now. And he's spent the last 4 years in one of the United Kingdom's most brutal prisons, Belmarsh. And this is just a continuation of Biden's war on whistleblowers. The Trump administration put forward 18 indictments against Assange, including violating the Espionage Act, which they're charging against Julian Assange. Remember, the U.S. Espionage Act, quote, says, to convey false reports or false statements with intent to interfere with the operation or success of the military or naval forces of the United States, or to promote the success of its enemies when the United States is at war, to cause or to attempt to cause insubordination, disloyalty, mutiny, refusal of duty in the military or naval forces of the United States. This is the most broad and anti-free speech clause really that we have in the United States. The espionage is an absolutely brutal part of our legal system, and is a very clear affront to any kind of pretenses of democracy. Remember, this has been only utilized in very small cases. Notably, Eugene Debs, the leader of the American Socialist Party, was jailed for violating the Espionage Act because of his opposition to the Great Imperial War of World War I. The government right now is so clearly trying to get revenge while increasing their ability to attack press freedom and silence whistleblowers. I do not have patience anymore for people getting worked up about Hillary Clinton and the emails that were leaked by WikiLeaks. Because one, Assange should face no punishment for that. You can be mad that Hillary Clinton was saying the things that she was saying and that those things got exposed personally. But if you are going to sit here and say that journalists do not have the ability or the responsibility to bring light information to the public about major, important, powerful figures like the president, somebody who's trying to become the president of the United States, you've got some serious issues. But all of that aside, right? Again, I have no patience for that argument, but all of that aside, that is not what he is being charged for. He is being charged for exposing American war crimes, where U.S. soldiers fired and killed a host of journalists, where the U.S. military was engaged in massive torture operations, right? The United States government is attacking Assange just like they've been attacking Chelsea Manning and have not allowed her to have any peace after the horrors that she has experienced. Assange continues to be targeted again for exposing the most brutal acts of the American occupation, invasion of Afghanistan and Iraq. He's faced threats against his life. He's been personally abused by American agents. The Trump administration, right, was speaking with the CIA about ways to assassinate Julian Assange. Julian Assange's children have had their diapers stolen by Spanish private investigators who were trying to get their DNA. Can you imagine the horror, knowing the history of this country and the brutality with which it treats its enemies? And particularly the CIA, the fear that any human being would have, not only for themselves, but for their loved ones and their children. If you were alerted to something like that happening to somebody close to you, this has been a slow moving horror that has been happening for a long time. And I know it's can be sort of frustrating because, the fundamental facts of the matter haven't changed, right? But that is a part of this game here, is to put him through an excruciatingly slow legal process, through horrible threats against his life and the lives of his family, so that people forget about him. Why do you think there's now been a decades-long attempt to convince Americans, and particularly liberal Americans, that Assange, who exposed the war crimes of both Bush, right, supposedly the enemy of liberal America, and then Obama, is a criminal. It has been a massive operation to try to manufacture consent, manufacture silence on what is the most clear example of out of control government trying to threaten and attack journalists. This is bad enough on what it's doing to this human being and to their family and the people close to Julian. But this has a major effect. I think that should move you enough, but this affects all of us on a very deep level. This affects what news organizations are willing to publish. Major news organizations right now are being advised by their legal teams to start to change their protocols to prevent them from being targeted by the government. This is things that will have knockdown effects, like silencing important revelations. Remember the incredible exposition of what was going on with the U.S. government in trying to, in the way that they were trying to imprison and embarrass Lula da Silva, right? This is the kind of stuff that they're trying to silence. And Lord in heaven, for those in independent media, people who don't have the luxury of well-financed legal teams to protect them, the threat of being targeted as an individual by the United States has a massively chilling effect. The government and the Biden administration, and again, if you're not somebody who's motivated by politics for the same reason as me, you should remind people that Biden is now continuing a Trump policy. Right? Joe Biden is supposed to reset this country. Joe Biden is now continuing one of the more egregious aspects of the Trump presidency to attack Assange. The government is counting on our apathy and many people's manufactured hatred of Assange to wage war on him, and even more largely to wage war on journalists as a whole. And we can't allow a future where telling the truth means risking literally everything.
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing to underline is Assange is an Australian citizen, and this is basically the sort of grand reason they want to do this, apart from petty cruelty, is that message that no matter where you are in the globe, if you expose things that we don't want you to expose, we can bring you here and prosecute you, and that is an insane thing for any nation to be able to do.
Totally. And, I think there's a limit to how much we can point out the hypocrisy. But when, liberal America, understandably, because, the system that they have for press freedom in Russia is absolutely dystopian, are very, very willing, to condemn Putin for his attacks on journalism in that country, should be the first ones standing up to say that the United States should not be not only trying to silence journalists, but as Matt was noting, foreign journalists who are exposing American crimes abroad. I mean, the hypocrisy is just rank on this shit. And they are counting on silence, and they're also counting on people who feel the same way that we do, sort of exhaustion with this. Because, the point of it being a 10-year-long process now is to make it so, the uproar isn't as strong, because, the memory is distant for people of what it was like when those revelations were made, right? And we just cannot allow that to happen.
Absolutely.
Well, y'all, on that note, we got some fire with us to go into the post game. Join us over there probably pretty soon. We'll be taking questions from the Discord. Again, you can leave us a voicemail. We'd love to hear from y'all at 1-940-289-7234. Patreon.com/leftreckoning. See patrons in a couple minutes. And see the rest of y'all next week.
Peace. All right, we'll do